There are moments in a life that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with thunder or warning. They come quietly, disguised as ordinary afternoons, and you only understand them later, when the dust has settled and you're sitting somewhere still, replaying the seconds that changed everything. This is one of those stories. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, you'll recognize something in it. Something you felt before but never quite had the words for. Her name was Maren Voss, and she had been riding this land since before she could read. She grew up on the edge of the Ostmark Valley, in a part of the world that most maps forgot to label carefully. The hills there were long and slow, like the backs of sleeping animals half buried in soil and time. The trees grew dense along the lower ridges and thinned out toward the high meadows where the wind came in sideways and smelled of pine and cold water and something harder to name. Something mineral, something ancient. It was not a dramatic landscape. Not the kind of country you'd put on a postcard. It was simply real. Heavy with roots and weather and years of quiet human life. And Maren had known every corner of it since childhood, the way a person knows the floor plan of their childhood home in the dark, by feel, by memory, by something that lives below conscious thought and never really goes away. She was 31 now. The farm had been in her family for 4 generations, and when her father's health began to fail the previous spring, the full weight of it had passed to her shoulders without ceremony. There was no grand conversation, no formal handover. One morning she woke up and the responsibilities were simply there, the way weather arrives. Already present. Already asking things of her. And she had been carrying them since. The land was not easy. It had never pretended to be. There were debts her father hadn't mentioned until late. Repairs that had been deferred for longer than was wise. A fence line along the eastern pasture that had collapsed in 3 places over winter and would need to be redone before the ground froze. She moved through it all methodically, the way she did most things. Quietly, without complaint, making a list and working through it one item at a time. She was not the kind of woman who dramatized her suffering. Her father hadn't been that way either, and she supposed she had learned it from him. The particular discipline of keeping your heart or feelings folded neatly, stored somewhere you didn't have to look at them too often. It wasn't suppression, exactly. It was more like a kind of respect for difficulty. An acknowledgement that some things deserve to be felt privately, in their own time. She was managing. That was the honest word for it. The horse's name was Sorrel. He was 12 years old, a dark bay with a wide chest and calm eyes the color of wet earth, eyes that always seemed slightly older than the rest of him, like they had been watching the world for longer than any single body could contain. Her father had bought him at a farm auction 2 valleys over when Maren was in her early 20s. She had been there when the trailer ramp came down. She had watched the horse step out onto the gravel of the yard with a kind of unhurried certainty, looking around at the new landscape without anxiety, and then looking directly at her for a long moment before dropping his head to investigate a patch of grass at the edge of the lane. She had known, then. The way you sometimes simply know. In the years since, they had built the kind of partnership that doesn't happen often and can't be engineered. She had ridden other horses, difficult ones, young ones, unpredictable ones. But Sorrel was different in a way she never tried to put into words, because putting it into words seemed like it might diminish it. He was steady. He was honest. He didn't perform calmness as a kind of trained compliance. His stillness came from somewhere deeper. He was calm the way a river is calm on a clear, windless morning, not because nothing is moving, but because everything moving is moving in its right direction and there is no conflict in it. She trusted him completely. And she knew, in the way of people who have spent real time with animals, that the trust was mutual in whatever way trust can be mutual across the space between species. That afternoon in late October, she had set out on the eastern trail just after midday. The sky was the pale, flat white of an overcast autumn day, the kind of light that has no shadows in it, that makes distance hard to judge and softens all the edges of things. She had things to do. She always had things to do. The trough in the lower field had been losing water steadily for 2 weeks, and she had been putting it off because there was always something more urgent pressing. But the cattle had been moved into that pasture for winter, and a compromised water supply was not something she could continue to defer. She let Sorrel set the pace. He moved in his usual unhurried way, hoofs finding the familiar ground without hesitation, ears relaxed and tilted slightly forward. The beech leaves had turned mostly gold by now, some still clinging to branches, others already fallen and lying in deep, papery layers on the trail that softened the sound of his footsteps until it was nearly nothing. The air had that particular October quality, cool and sharp and carrying the faint sweetness of decomposition, not unpleasant, just honest, the smell of a season completing itself. She wasn't thinking about anything specific. Or rather, she was thinking about many things in the unfocused, drifting way the mind moves when the body is occupied with something familiar. The fence repair. A letter she owed a cousin. A number in the accounts that didn't quite balance. These thoughts floated through without urgency, passing and dissolving. This was what she valued most about being out on the land. The way the mind could go quiet without effort. The landscape absorbing the noise, holding it in a distance, letting her simply exist inside the motion and the cold air and the rhythm of a horse moving beneath her. They were perhaps 15 minutes out from the farmyard when Sorrel stopped. It was not an abrupt stop. Not the startled, electric halt of an animal that has sensed something predatory. No throwing up of the head. No sideways shy. No tension flooding through his body. It was simply a stopping. Quiet. Deliberate. As if he had reached an invisible threshold and decided, without agitation or drama, that he would not cross it. Marin looked up. She looked around quickly, the way you do when something interrupts a daydream and the mind rushes back to the present. The trail ahead was clear. The beeches stood on either side, perfectly still in the windless air. There was no sound she hadn't expected. No movement in the undergrowth. Nothing her eyes could identify as a reason for the interruption. She pressed her legs gently against his sides. The familiar signal. The quiet ask she had used 10,000 times across 12 years of riding. Sorrel did not move. He stood with his head at a comfortable height, not raised in alarm, not lowered in submission, simply held at the angle of a creature who has made a decision and is patient about it. She felt it through her entire body, through the contact of seat and leg and hand. She knew how this horse felt when he was afraid, and this was not it. She knew how he felt when he was being stubborn about something trivial, and this was not that either. This was something else. Something she didn't have a word for. A quality of intention. As if he had not merely stopped but had specifically chosen to stop here, at this exact point, for a reason he could not explain to her in any language she spoke. She pressed again, a little firmer. She made the low, encouraging sound she used when she needed him to trust her through something difficult. He shifted his weight and she thought for a moment he was going to move forward. But he didn't. He settled back into his stillness. And then, with a deliberateness she felt clearly, he took one step to the left. Not forward. Left. Sideways, half off the trail, and then he stopped again, and his head came up slightly, and his gaze fixed on something specific at the edge of the path ahead. She followed the line of his attention. The tree stood on the right side of the trail, maybe 6 meters ahead. A beech, like the others, old and broad, its bark the gray-brown of aged wood, deeply furrowed, weathered by seasons she could not count. Moss grew in green patches along the lower trunk. Bracket fungi, orange and shelf-like, had established themselves at the base. It looked entirely ordinary. Like every other tree on this trail. Like something she had ridden past hundreds of times without a second glance. She almost missed it. It was at roughly eye height from horseback, slightly to the right of center on the trunk. Nearly invisible, because the tree had been growing around it for a very long time. The bark had shifted and thickened and partially reclaimed the marks, softening the edges, filling in the angles, blurring the lines into something almost indistinguishable from natural wear. But once her eyes found the shape, she couldn't lose it. The mind, once it sees a pattern, cannot unsee it. A carving. Not initials. Not the idle knifework of a bored afternoon. This was deliberate and purposeful, made by someone who had known exactly what they were doing. She stared at it for several seconds, assembling the shapes through the distortion of decades of bark growth, and then the parts resolved into a whole. An arrow. A directional mark, simple and definitive, pointing downward, in to the right, angled off the trail in a specific direction. Below it, carved in letters that time had made partly illegible, were 3 characters she had to study before she could read them. Foul. Just those 3 letters. Whether what followed had been consumed by the bark, or whether 3 letters had been enough, she couldn't know. But the arrow was clear. And the direction it indicated was clear. And something in her, some quiet, attentive part of her that she had inherited from generations of people who had worked this land and learned to read what it showed them, told her to get down. She dismounted carefully, looped Sorrel's reins around the low branch, and walked toward the direction the carving indicated. The ground off the trail looked unremarkable. Leaves everywhere, deep and undisturbed. Low ferns, brown and flattened. The occasional exposed root in gray stone. The surface sloped gently away from the path, which was completely normal for this section of the ridge. She had never thought anything of it. It was simply the edge of things, the point where the trail ended and the forest continued and there was no reason to go. She moved slowly. Part of her was aware that this might be nothing. The arrow might have marked a property boundary, a hunting indicator, a message between people long dead with no bearing on any current danger. She felt slightly self-conscious, doing something that might turn out to be unnecessary. But she kept moving. She stopped about 3 meters off the path and looked at the ground ahead, and something registered. It took a moment to identify what her eyes were seeing. The leaves. They lay at a slightly different angle in a certain area, a subtle shift in their orientation that suggested the surface below them was not quite the same as the surface a meter back. The kind of detail that makes no impression unless you're moving slowly and looking carefully. She crouched down. She found a long branch near her feet and held it horizontally, advancing the far end slowly toward the area, pressing it downward. The end dropped. Not gradually. It dropped the way something drops when there is nothing beneath it, when the resistance you expected is simply absent. She held the branch there for a moment, feeling the absence on the other side. Then she pulled it back and used it to carefully push the leaves aside, revealing the edge beneath them. The earth had collapsed. At some point in the past, years ago or decades, the ground here had given way into whatever lay beneath the ridge. The collapse had left the fissure roughly a meter wide, running for several meters along the edge of the slope. It was not visible from the trail because the leaf accumulation was deep and the angle of the terrain hid the transition. You would not see it until you were past the point where seeing it would help you. You would simply step onto what looked like solid ground, and it would not be. She sat back on her heels. Her heart was doing something heavy and unsteady that she only became aware of in the quiet that followed. She looked at the edge. She looked at the trail behind her. She understood, without effort, what would have happened if she had come through here in fading light, in a hurry, her mind somewhere else. What would have happened on a foggy morning, or in the first snow of the season, or simply on one of those afternoons when the body moves through familiar country on autopilot because familiar country doesn't seem to require your full attention. She stood and walked back to Sorrel. He was exactly where she had left him, watching her return with those quiet, steady eyes. She came to him and put both hands against the side of his neck, and she stood there without speaking, feeling his warmth, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing, feeling the massive, patient aliveness of him. Something in her chest that had been held at a particular tension for a long time, maybe for months, maybe longer, loosened very slightly. She stayed with him for a while, long enough that the stillness stopped feeling like something she was waiting to end. Then she looked at the carving again. Foul. 3 letters and an arrow. Made by hands she would never know, belonging to a person she could not name, in some years she couldn't determine. Someone had stood here. Someone had looked at what she had just looked at, had felt something close to what she was feeling now, and had then taken a knife and marked a tree. Not for themselves. They already knew. For the next person. For whoever would come after, on whatever ordinary afternoon may happen to pass this way, mind on other things, body on autopilot. A gift made to a stranger. An act of care extended across time, across whatever gap separated one human life from another, placed in the bark of a tree and left there to wait. She thought about the patience of that. The faith of it. She remounted and turned sorrel back toward the farm, the trough forgotten, and she rode home at a walk, paying attention to the trail in a way she never had before, because this trail was familiar and familiar things. She was learning, do not always stay that way. And if you're still here, moving through this story quietly beside her, then maybe something in it is finding you where you are. You're welcome to stay. You can like the video if it's speaking to you, or simply let the story keep unfolding. Back at the farmhouse, the afternoon had almost finished itself by the time she put Sorrel in a stall and went inside. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink and stood at the window while the kettle heated, watching the last pale light dissolve into evening. She made tea the way her father had always made it. Too strong. The bag left in until the color went dark and the flavor got slightly bitter. Enough milk to turn it the shade of autumn mud. She had teased him about it endlessly when she was young. Now she made it the same way every time and had stopped noticing she was doing it. She sat at the kitchen table with the mug between her hands. The kitchen was the oldest part of the farmhouse, its walls thick enough to muffle the wind that was beginning to pick up in the trees to the north. The table had been in this room for as long as anyone in the family could remember. Its surface was marked with the accidental record of all the uses it had been put to, a burn from something set down carelessly, a groove from a knife used as a straight edge, the particular smoothness in one spot where generations of elbows had rested through long conversations and solitary evenings, and everything else a table accumulates when it lives in the middle of a family's life long enough. She had done her schoolwork here as a child, her father at the other end with his farm records, the radio on low. She had sat here through the first hard nights after her mother left, when she was 15, both of them present in the room without speaking, because sitting in the same space was the closest thing available to comfort. She had sat here this past spring, holding the phone against her ear while the doctor spoke in careful language about her father's heart, looking at the burn mark on the table as something certain and unchanging while everything else shifted into new and frightening shapes. It was a table that had witnessed a life. Several lives. And it remained, solid and unhurried, the way the best things do. She thought again about the person who had carved the mark. Who had they been? Someone local, certainly. Someone with a knowledge of this land detailed enough to understand that the collapsed ground was a genuine danger. Someone who had stood at that edge and felt the absence of solid ground beneath the leaves, and who had then, instead of simply noting it as a personal discovery and moving on, had stopped to do something about it. That was the part she kept returning to. The decision to stop. The decision to do a small, careful, invisible thing for a stranger who might never come, or might come the very next day, or might not come for 50 years. To care about someone you would never meet, in a place where no one would see you caring, for no reward beyond the knowledge that you had done it. Her father had been like that. A man who repaired things that weren't his to repair and helped people who hadn't asked and left places better than he found them without ever making any announcement about it. He would have stopped at that tree. She was certain. He would have felt the same thing she had felt, recognized the same danger, and he would have done something about it, quietly, without telling anyone. She wondered, briefly, if the carving had been his. She let herself hold the thought for a moment before gently setting it aside. She didn't think it was true. But she let herself hold it anyway, because some possibilities are comforting even when they're unlikely. She missed him in the simple, unanswerable way of people who have lost someone they relied on. Not with the sharp, chest-opening grief of the early months, but with the quieter ache of accumulating absence, all the moments that keep revealing themselves as moments he should have been in. She would be doing something ordinary, checking a water level or standing in a field looking at the sky, and she would think of something she wanted to say to him, and then remember, again, that the direction of that conversation only went one way now. She was learning to carry that. It was slow work. Outside, the wind was strengthening. She could hear it in the old beeches at the north corner of the yard, the ones her great-grandfather had planted as a windbreak, now grown into a stand of significant age and height. They made a particular sound in strong wind, a deep, collective rushing that was somehow both restless and calming at once, like a very large living thing breathing. After a while, she got up and found the farm record book. It had been her father's, before that his father's, a thick ledger with a water-stained cover and pages of varying age and handwriting, the older ones fragile at the edges and written in the looping, careful script of people taught to write in the way of an earlier century. She had been adding to it herself since spring, joining her handwriting to the others in the way of someone stepping into a long conversation that began before them and will continue after. She found an empty section near the back and wrote a careful entry. She recorded the location as precisely as she could from memory. The beach corridor on the Eastern Trail, approximately 15 minutes from the upper pasture gate at a walk, on the right side of the path just before it curves toward the dry stream bed. She described the collapsed ground, where it was relative to the trail, how it was concealed by leaf accumulation and not visible from the path, and that anyone going off the trail here should be aware of it. Then she wrote about the carving, its position on the tree, what it showed, the arrow and the letters. She wrote that she believed it had been made as a warning, and that it had worked, and that she thought the information it contained should be recorded so that it would not depend only on a single tree. She dated the entry and signed it. It was a small act, a quiet act. No one would applaud it or even know it had happened. But it felt like the right response. A continuation of something that had been started by an unknown hand in an unknown season. A chain of quiet care passed forward through time. She spent the rest of the evening doing small tasks. Mending a section of leather harness that had been sitting in the corner for 2 weeks. Oiling the hinges on the stable door. Reorganizing a shelf of tools that had fallen into slight disorder. The kind of manageable, physical work that uses the hands and gives the mind space to move where it needs to. It was the kind of work her father had always done in the evenings when the larger tasks of the day were finished. Maintenance. Keeping things sound. The small, invisible labor of ensuring that nothing deteriorates faster than it has to. She had found, since spring, that she was more like him in this than she had previously understood. Grief does something to a person's relationship with maintenance. It teaches you, in a way nothing else quite does, the value of tending to what you have while you still have it. When the tasks were done, she stood at the kitchen window in the dark, looking out at the farmyard lit faintly by the lamp above the stable door. The shapes of things barely visible. The edge of the barn roof. The line of the stone wall along the near pasture. The dark mass of the windbreak beaches against the sky without stars. She thought about ordinary afternoons. How many of them there are in a life. How most of them pass through without leaving a mark, their details blurring into the general texture of ordinary time. And how occasionally, without warning, one of them contains something that quietly changes the shape of everything that follows. Not dramatically, always. Sometimes almost invisibly. A moment where the world becomes briefly legible in a way it usually isn't. This had been that kind of afternoon. She had ridden a trail she had ridden hundreds of times. She had been thinking about a leaking trough. And then a horse had stopped, and a tree had held an old mark, and the ground had shown her what it was, and she had come home changed in a way that was difficult to articulate but was real. She was not quite the same person who had saddled up after lunch. She had been reminded of something she knew but often forgot. That attention matters. That the world is full of edges that look like solid ground. That somewhere in the past, someone had cared enough to carve a warning and trust time to carry it forward. She checked on Sorrel before going to bed. The stable was warm and dim, smelling of hay and horse and the particular comfort of animals at rest. He was dozing, his weight shifted to one hip, his eyes half closed. His breath came in long, slow exhalations that made small clouds in the cool air. She stood in the doorway and watched him without going in, not wanting to disturb him, just wanting to be present in the same space for a moment. She thought about 12 years of shared life. Every ride, every hour spent in close proximity, every time she had asked something of him and he had given it, every time he had needed something from her and she had learned to provide it. A relationship built entirely from consistency and attention, from the patient practice of showing up. In that sense, it was not so different from any relationship that mattered. He had stopped on a trail she thought she knew. He had stood firm when she pressed him, not from stubbornness, not from fear, but from something she still struggled to name precisely. She kept returning to the word knowing. She was not a person comfortable with mystical interpretations of animal behavior. She had grown up practical, in a practical landscape, around people who trusted what they could see and verify. But she had also grown up close enough to animals to understand that they occupy the world through registers of perception not available to human beings, that they receive information through senses organized differently, attending to what we have learned to filter out. Sorrel had noticed something. Whether it was a change in air pressure, a subtle shift in the ground, some olfactory signal from the collapsed earth that she had no ability to detect, she would never know. But he had known, in some register, on some level. He had known that going forward was not what needed to happen. And he had decided to stop. That patient, quiet, unambiguous refusal that was not fear and not stubbornness but something that felt, impossibly, like care. She went inside and climbed the stairs. She lay in the dark with the wind moving in the trees outside her window and the farm around her, large and quiet and asking nothing of her, for once, in this small portion of the night. She thought about the people whose handwriting filled the record book downstairs. Her great-grandfather, who had built the oldest section of the house. Her great-grandmother, who had a way with growing things that people from neighboring farms had come simply to see. Her grandfather, known to her only through photographs and other people's stories. Her father, whose handwriting she saw now in her own, in certain letters, in the way she formed certain words without thinking. She thought about the unknown person who had carved the warning. One of this long, quiet lineage of people who had tried, in their own small ways, to pass something forward. Not glory. Not legacy in any formal sense. Just knowledge. Care. The small acts of preservation that make it possible for the next person to stand on ground that has already been tested. We are held up, she thought, by so much work we never see. By so many hands that studied things before we arrived and will continue studying things after we are gone. By warnings in bark and entries in ledgers and paths marked in water sources noted in all the 10,000 small careful acts by which people who love a place transmit that love across time to people they will never meet. We are so rarely aware of it. And then one afternoon a horse stops on a trail you know by heart, and you look where you have never thought to look, and the world shows you a little of what it has been holding. And you understand, at least for a moment, that you are not alone in it. That you have never been alone in it. That the land itself is full of the careful attention of people who came before you, marked and held and waiting for the next pair of eyes that happened to be paying attention at the right moment, in the right place, on an afternoon that began as nothing more than an errand and became something else entirely. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind. In the stable, Sorrel breathed slowly in the dark, deep in whatever rest horses enter, large and warm and present. The farm held everything quietly, the way it had for 4 generations, the way it would continue holding things long after the names changed and the hands changed and the book on the shelf was filled and a new one begun. And in the bark of an old beech tree on the eastern trail, the arrow continued to point. Faded and half-consumed and still, against all expectation, legible. Still doing the work it had been made to do. Still pointing toward the edge. Still saying, to whoever would stop long enough to read it, be careful here. Someone came before you. Someone thought of you. Someone wanted you to know. That is the thing about quiet warnings. The ones that don't shout, that don't insist, that ask nothing more of you than your attention. They cannot work unless you slow down enough to receive them. They cannot save you if you're moving too fast to see. They require a kind of presence, a willingness to let the familiar become unfamiliar for just a moment, to look at what you think you know as if you don't quite know it yet. And when you do, when you actually do, when something in you goes still enough to hear what is being said in the silence, what is being pointed to in the bark of an ordinary tree, what is being communicated in the patient refusal of an animal who has been paying attention on your behalf, then sometimes the whole ordinary afternoon rearranges itself into something that stays with you. Long after you've gone home. Long after the tea has gone cold. Long after the lamp is out and the wind has moved on and the night has settled into its deep, unhurried middle. It stays. The way the best things stay. Quietly. Without asking anything. Simply present, the way a mark in bark is present, the way care persists across time when it has been given with enough sincerity. Still there when you go looking for it. Still pointing in the right direction. If this story stayed with you tonight, you can leave a like or find a word for it in the comments below. And if you'd like to return to stories like this, told slowly, told carefully, with room to breathe, then you're welcome to subscribe. We'll be here, quiet and waiting, whenever you need somewhere to come back to.